Okay, David, I think I'm ready to get started if you want to switch the video over to me. Welcome to everyone who is on with us today. We are 100 people strong this afternoon. My name is Sarah Gillooly, and I am the Vice President for State Outreach and Engagement here at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I love the role that I play in the work that we do at Americans United, where for more than 70 years we've been safeguarding our shared American value of religious freedom for all people. In courts and in Congress and in communities across America, AU fights for our freedom to practice any religion we want or no religion at all, so long as we aren't harming others, because that is the promise of religious freedom in our Constitution. Today, we're kicking off our 2020 Summer Speaker Series, where every Tuesday in June at 3 p.m. Eastern or 12 p.m. Pacific, we'll be bringing you AU experts along with our colleagues, exciting special guests from across the religious freedom movement to spend some time with you. Be sure to join us every Tuesday at 3 p.m. You can register for the next 4 webinars in the series at au.org/speaker series. We're also broadcasting all of these webinars live on Facebook. So if you don't get a chance to register or Zoom isn't your speed, feel free to just join us simply by clicking on our Facebook feed every Tuesday in June at 3 p.m. Eastern. We'll also be recording many or hopefully all of these sessions in June, and we'll be posting those on au.org/speaker series as well, so you can catch up later. And before I get started, I wanted to cover a little bit of housekeeping. We want to hear from you today. Rob and I do this work because we love the issue, but more importantly, we love the people and the passionate advocates who are on the ground in every state in this country and abroad, working to protect religious freedom for all. So if you'll notice on the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A box. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring those questions throughout the session, and Rob will definitely be taking questions towards the end. If you'd like to just chat and just visit with folks with us here at AU, please feel free to use the chat box as well. So we're so excited to welcome you and to be kicking off this month-long series with Rob Boston. Rob has been with AU for nearly 30 years, maybe longer, and is our senior advisor as well as the editor of Church State magazine. Rob is the author of 4 books on religious freedom and separation of religion and government, and there is no one better in this country to bring us today an hour about an introduction to Religious Freedom 101. What do we need to know to be engaged citizens and engaged advocates in our communities on religious freedom? So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Rob Boston, and I'll look forward to seeing all of you at the end of the webinar. Thank you. Rob?
Thank you, Sarah. And thanks to all of you who have joined us today. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you. And as Sarah mentioned, when I'm done talking, I'll be happy to take any questions or comments you might have. So just hang on to those and we'll have a discussion about those at the end. You know, every nation has an origin story. And that origin story is often a combination of actual history and myth. The challenge of any historian, whether that is a professional historian or an amateur like myself, is to separate those two strands, to pull the actual verifiable history from the myth. But it's important when we're doing that we don't just discard the myth, because the myth speaks to us too. The myth exists for a reason, and the myth has power. So as we have this discussion today, let's remember that we're going to be looking at those two strands and clearly acknowledging one can be factually backed up by the evidence, one can be supported by documents and other types of evidence, the other not so much, but still motivates people to do things, to behave in a certain way, and to act. So we need to understand it as well. In the case of the United States, one of our founding myths is that we were a land birthed in religious liberty. We were created for religious liberty. That our history speaks to that. And it is a comforting myth. It makes us feel good, makes us feel righteous and decent, kind. We pioneered this concept, but it's not exactly accurate. If you go back and you look at the period of European settlement in this country, what you see are people bringing a mix of motivations for why they settled, why they tried to come here, why they wanted to be in this nation. And oftentimes, those motivations were commercial or mercantile. You had people wanting to make money. European nations wanting to establish colonies in the New World so they could exploit resources, seize land from the original owners, the Native Americans, take what they wanted. That was a motivating factor for a lot of people. And if you look at the situation involving the people who did come here for religious freedom, and by that I mean the Puritans who established Massachusetts Bay Colony, what you find is they had a very limited understanding of religious freedom. Yes, they wanted religious freedom, but only for themselves. They did not understand or appreciate that as a universal human right. They had left Europe because they were unhappy with the way they were being treated. They came to this new world, and they felt, as a lot of theocrats have throughout history, the common mistake of the theocrat is to believe that they have stumbled upon the one mode of worship that is pleasing to God and that is good. And the Puritans embraced that idea. They were God's chosen people, and that their church was the one that God really wanted to see established in the world. So their vision of religious freedom was very limiting. It was for themselves. Well, obviously, we've come a long way over the course of more than 300 years. How do we get to that place? From that place of theocratic government, church and state combined together, intolerance. How did we get from that place to where we have come to be? A nation that really does, on its best days, honor religious liberty, embrace the concept that the individual has the right to decide what religion, if any, they wish to adopt. Well, that's the story we're going to talk about today. And as we do that, we're going to be pulling apart those strands, separating the history from the myth, and a little bit later on, asking why the myth still motivates so many people and what power it may have. Now, I talked about the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and remember that this was a settlement in New England, a hostile wilderness. People basically had to build everything from scratch. Life was very difficult. But one of the things the Puritans believed in very strongly was that their mode of worship was pleasing to God and was good. And because they had that view, they didn't really have a lot of tolerance for other types of believers. But as their colony grew, inevitably you had people coming into the area who did not hold to the Puritans' view on religion. And this created some tension. One of the early dissenters was a gentleman named Roger Williams. Roger Williams was a Puritan minister himself. He was born in England around 1603. Nobody's really sure of the exact date, but around that time. And Williams, as an advocate for religious freedom, really began to butt heads with the Puritan establishment because Williams was outspoken. Not only did he advocate religious freedom for everybody, a concept that he called soul liberty. That's S-O-U-L, soul liberty, the birthright of all people. Not only did he believe that, but he publicly advocated that. Now, today we would think, oh, no big deal. That's fine. You can say what you want. That was not the way the Massachusetts Bay Colony operated. The Puritans did not believe in that type of freedom of expression or freedom of religion. So Roger Williams attempts to upset what Puritans perceived to be the natural order of things was very disturbing to them. Williams advocated, even at this early period in the 17th century, for a separation of religion and government. Now, that was a very radical idea at the time. Remember, the European experience had been exactly the opposite. Centuries of religion and government combined, whether it was a Protestant church or a Catholic church, some kind of a church in alliance with the state, not hesitating to kill dissenters, to find them, to imprison them, to torture them. For hundreds of years, that was the common experience. And then here comes Roger Williams arguing that that was not the way it was meant to be. Roger Williams once said, "Forced religion stinks in the nostrils of God." Now remember, this is a Puritan minister, a very devout man personally, strongly believed that God wanted people to be free. Williams spoke of a gap or hedge or a wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. That phrase is interesting because it sort of stands a few years before something that Thomas Jefferson said later, which we'll discuss. But here's Williams talking about this idea of a wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world being this kind of frankly frightening place. Outside the colony, the world was dangerous. It wasn't safe to venture much beyond where Europeans had settled. But the church was a garden. The church was a place where you could rest, refresh, see beauty, experience things. Those two institutions needed to be separated, according to Williams, because the church would be corrupted by the world, by the state, and because every person should have the right to choose for himself or herself how they would worship God and whether they would worship God. Now, in 1635, Williams had been writing about religious liberty, had been advocating for it, was arrested and charged with, and I love this phrase, disseminating new and dangerous ideas. I think we should all strive to be charged with that at some point in our lives, disseminating new and dangerous ideas. What was the new and dangerous idea of religious freedom? Soul liberty, the right to decide for yourself. This is 1635. 1636, Williams gets word that he's going to be arrested and forcibly shipped back to England. The Puritan leaders had enough of him. They were going to put him on a boat. They were going to send him back to England. Get rid of this troublemaker who's telling people that they can interact with God on their own, that they don't need the intermediary of a priest or a pastor or a minister. A very dangerous idea, Puritan Massachusetts. Well, Williams was tipped off that he was going to be arrested. Someone let him know this was going to happen. He fled into the wilderness. Williams had established good relations with the Native Americans. He spoke several native languages, and he went into the wilderness, contacted his Native American allies, and arranged to purchase land. This is interesting in and of itself, that he bought this land. He didn't just take it, which is what everybody else was doing. He purchased the land, he founded his own community, and he called it Providence. We know Providence today as the capital of Rhode Island, and indeed Roger Williams is considered to be the founder of Rhode Island. And in Providence, unlike the Massachusetts Bay Colony, everyone had the right to worship as they saw fit, as guided by conscience. Even Quakers. Roger Williams personally disliked Quakers. He didn't like their theology. He didn't care much for it at all. But Quakers worshiped unmolested in Providence, whereas in Massachusetts, they had difficulties. 4 Quaker martyrs were even executed in Massachusetts because of their belief system. So you had this real spirit of religious liberty in Providence, and that was the model that became dominant. Now, it didn't happen overnight. It took time. It took a lot of struggle, bitter experience, violence even. But that model of religious liberty, embraced by Williams and those who followed him to Providence, became the dominant view in this country. But we had a little bit more work to do to get there. Let's talk about that a little bit now. As more and more colonies were settled, and as more and more people came and from European nations settled here, usually seized land, enslaved people. I mean, there's a lot in the history here that is not good, and we must face that too. As we're talking about this issue of religious liberty, as we're thinking about the vision of the Founding Fathers, which in the area of religious freedom was very forward-looking, we must acknowledge that in other areas, their views were not forward-looking at all. They were dangerous. They embraced slavery. They subjugated women. They created a system that pushed all the power up to white landowners. So many of the things that they did, we know from modern experience, were not good. But in religious liberty, that's one thing they did get right, because they took that concept and they built a nation that really has that foundation. But as I said, it took a little bit of time to get there. Think about those early colonies. Depending on where you lived, that determined how much religious liberty you had. If you had the good fortune to live in Providence with Roger Williams and his followers, well, then you were okay. You had a lot of religious freedom, even non-Christians. Jews built some of the first synagogues in Rhode Island because they knew they had the right to worship there unmolested, whereas in other colonies, they had had a very difficult time of it. If you lived in the Carolinas, you were living under the Anglican Church, the Church of England, established by law. Everybody had to support it. Everybody had to pay for it, whether you belonged to it or not. If you lived in Virginia, same situation, Anglican Church, established by law. If you lived in Pennsylvania, you might have a little bit more freedom. If you live in New York, you had a little bit more freedom. If you lived in Maryland, you had a heavy Catholic presence. It really depended on where you were living. And the interesting thing about those early days is sometimes we assume that, oh, everybody back then was Christian. They were either a Protestant, a small number of Catholics, and maybe allowing for a small number of Jews as well, but most people were Christian, and that's probably true. But we have had religious diversity in this country a lot longer than people think. We always did have a Jewish presence. We even had an Islamic presence and nativist religions that were represented by people who were brought here in chains, enslaved people. So we have had that experience, that diversity with us from day one. So, the ingredients were always there for true pluralism and tolerance and diversity. We just needed to find the catalyst to bring that to bear. What happened is that the model of forcing or coercing or requiring people to belong to religion, to pay for it, to support it when they didn't belong to these churches, quickly proved to be unworkable. You had people standing up and very aggressively stating that they did not wish to be forced to support a religion that they did not believe in. The experience in the colony of Virginia is key to our story, because the Virginia experience eventually was sort of writ large and became the national experience. What happened in Virginia is that you had leaders like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who understood that from their Enlightenment principles, that religious freedom was, in fact, the right of every person. Remember, the Enlightenment wasn't so much an attack on religion or an attempt to tear religion down, as it was an understanding that there were other ways of knowing things, other ways of understanding things. During the Middle Ages, the default position was always religion, that religion would be the answer to everything. The Enlightenment challenged that by saying, well, we have science, we have reason, we have other ways of understanding the world around us. So the Enlightenment brought that to bear. Jefferson, Madison, and others were champions of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment taught them that every person should have the right to religious freedom. And Jefferson was pushing this as early as 1776. He promoted a bill in Virginia that would have established religious freedom for all people. But there were some other things going on in 1776 that you might be aware of, and it was difficult to sometimes get legislation through colonies. So nothing came of that. But after the Revolution, that idea began to take hold. After the Revolution, a lot of old ideas that had been transported from England, that had been brought over from Europe, were examined in a new light. We had thrown off the yoke of the king. We had stated that we did not wish to live under a monarchy. We would have a different form of government. Well, what other ideas had been imported from England that were also not useful anymore? Well, one of them was that combination of church and state. It was time to look at a new way of doing things. There was a key moment in the year 1785 when Patrick Henry proposed that everybody in Virginia should pay a tax to support teachers of the Christian religion. Now, Patrick Henry is the guy that famously stood up and railed, "Give me liberty or give me death." And every school child hears that story. And that was indeed a very powerful statement. But Patrick Henry was actually a theocrat all of his life. He argued that religion and government, Christianity and government, needed to be intertwined, that the state could not survive without the support of Christianity, and that Christianity needed help from the government. So he advocated for this idea. Now, Virginia had an established church already. As I mentioned, they had the Anglican Church. So Patrick Henry actually thought his idea maybe was a little bit more progressive, because under his plan, you would have the right to choose which Christian church you wish to support. You didn't have to support Anglicanism. You could choose some other ones. But it was still wrong, because you were still being forced to support a church against your will. And obviously, if you were non-Christian, you would find that offensive, but many Christians found it offensive as well. So Patrick Henry pushes this idea. James Madison rises up in opposition. James Madison, a young man at the time, a legislator, but a powerful intellect, pens this great document with a somewhat unwieldy title, the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. Now, I would have advised James Madison to give that a shorter title, for the modern era, something like Church Taxes? No way, because that's really what he was saying. The Memorial and Remonstrance is essentially a list of 15 reasons why no one should ever be forced to pay a church tax. And if you read it today, and it's online, you can find it, the arguments are just as powerful, just as fresh, and just as wonderful as they were in 1785. That memorial, that document by James Madison, circulated all over the state of Virginia. It was endorsed by many people and got back to the legislature. And when the legislature saw that there was such strong opposition to Patrick Henry's bill to force people to support religion, they rejected it. But Madison didn't stop there. He went back and he got that religious freedom bill that Thomas Jefferson had introduced originally in 1776, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. He got that back into the legislature and he pushed it through. Now, Thomas Jefferson wasn't in Virginia at the time. This is post-revolution. He was living in France. He was our ambassador there. But he and Madison talked by letter about this, and they discussed the bill, and Jefferson was very excited to find out that it had become law, that his friend and ally, James Madison, had pushed this through. And when it was being debated in the Virginia legislature, there was an effort to limit its protections to Christians only. Some lawmakers wanted to do that. They wanted to say, okay, yes, of course, you have the right to choose a religion as long as it is a Christian religion. But that did not get attached to the bill. As passed, the bill guaranteed everybody the right to choose their own faith, whether it was Christian or not. Jefferson, when he learned of this, rejoiced and wrote that the bill now protected the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. Even the infidels were protected. Jefferson was famous for his statements about true religious freedom, once stating that it did not matter whether his neighbor believed in 20 gods or no God, because that neither picks my pocket nor breaks my legs. So what Jefferson is saying there is, what your neighbor believes about God, how many gods he worships, whether he worships a God at all, doesn't affect you. It's his right to make that decision for himself. So there you have this really remarkable thing happening. Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, moving Virginia from a period of an established official church that everybody had to support to a model where there was complete religious freedom for everybody. An amazing thing. But it didn't end there. Madison took those ideas, took those concepts with him when the Constitution was being debated. Remember, after the Revolution, we had the Articles of Confederation, which they weren't workable. They were not a good system of government. So a decision was made to create a constitution. Madison took those ideas with him, but he couldn't get the other delegates to agree that there needed to be an explicit guarantee of religious freedom in the Constitution. So the Constitution, as originally written and as ratified, doesn't contain a guarantee of religious freedom. It has a provision at the end of Article 6 that says there will be no religious test or qualification for public office. In other words, you can't be forced to believe a certain thing about religion, to be a Christian or a Protestant before holding federal office. It does say that, but that's it. Otherwise, it's silent on religious freedom. Many legislators felt that there was no need to add an explicit protection of religious freedom or other rights, because nothing in the Constitution implied that the government would be able to infringe upon those rights. But within a year, people quickly realized, delegates and lawmakers realized, that was a mistake. The Constitution needed an explicit guarantee of the rights of the people. So Madison went back to work and he started producing this document. Now, the original thing that Madison produced was a little bit unwieldy. It was 20 new provisions to the Constitution, 20 new provisions. And Madison's feeling was that these could just be kind of inserted into the existing document. But a lot of people felt that really wasn't the way to go. So Congress got a hold of this document and they started paring it down. They reduced it from 20 to 12. These were presented to the states for ratification. Interestingly, what we know as the First Amendment today was originally the Third Amendment. There were two amendments ahead of it. One of those amendments was a somewhat unwieldy formula for determining the size of the House of Representatives. The other was an amendment that discussed under what circumstances Congress could vote itself a pay raise. That First Amendment faded into oblivion, but that second one about pay raises was ratified in 1992 and is now the 27th Amendment. But after those first two amendments were discarded, the Third Amendment moved up to the First Amendment position, and that's the First Amendment we know today. And it begins with the Declaration of Religious Freedom. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Think about those two concepts: no established church and religious freedom for everybody. Where have we seen that before? Well, Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, a document that disestablished the Anglican Church in Virginia and gave everyone the right to choose their own faith. So that principle, that concept from the Virginia experience, Madison took that with him during the debate over the Bill of Rights and got that into what became the First Amendment as we know it today. So that protection, that guarantee of religious freedom, at the time applied only to the federal government. Think about the First Amendment, which I recited a moment ago. It begins with the word Congress. Now, Madison would have applied those freedoms and those rights to the states as well, but he couldn't get enough political support to do that. So for a long time, the First Amendment, and indeed the entire Bill of Rights, applied only to the federal government. States continued to have their established churches. The last established church in the United States was in Massachusetts, and it did not get disestablished until 1833. So you had these states continuing their established churches. Well, they started to die there too, because people realized that that wasn't the way they wanted to live anymore. And the interesting thing about the story is clergy, many members of the clergy, helped lead the way to disestablish these churches. There's a really fascinating figure that you need to check out if you don't know about him, named John Leland. John Leland was a fiery Baptist minister. He was a friend of Thomas Jefferson, a strong advocate for religious liberty and separation of church and state. John Leland worked with Jefferson and Madison in Virginia to disestablish the official church there, where he lived for a while, and then went back to his home state of Massachusetts and did it there too. He was an instrumental role in disestablishing the Massachusetts official church, which was Congregationalism. And he would cross the border into Connecticut and help people do it there too. So he helped end, John Leland helped end officially established churches in 3 states, which is pretty amazing. John Leland once said, I love this quote, "The notion of a Christian commonwealth should be exploded forever." The idea that the government can have a religious expression, can have a preferred religion, was appalling to John Leland. He and other pastors, many of them traditional Baptists, stood up strongly for the right of everyone to pick their own religion, to pick their own faith. Now, if we think about this history so far, one of the things it tells us is that one of the religious right's favorite cherished myths is the idea of the Christian nation. Weren't we founded to be a Christian nation? Isn't that what the founders wanted? Well, no, not at all. If that had been their intention, they would have written that into the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution does the word Christianity appear, Jesus, Christ, God. Those words are not in there, and those omissions were deliberate. This was discussed, this was debated in the founding era, and the conscious choice was made to sever the relationship between church and state, not because the founders wanted a government or a society that was hostile to religion, but because they wanted one that was embracing and welcoming of different faiths and allowed people to make this most intimate decision for themselves. So when you look at the evidence, the lack of Christian references in the Constitution, the evidence from Article 6, which I mentioned a moment ago, that gives everybody the right to run for federal office, whether they believe in God or have a Christian faith or not. When you look at the experience of the founders coming out of the Enlightenment that championed religious freedom and human reason, you see that one of the cherished myths of the religious right of the Christian nation collapses. And you know, the ministers of that day, of the founding period and shortly thereafter, knew exactly what they had been given. They knew what the Constitution said, and they understood that they did not establish a Christian republic, and many of them were very angry about that. And there are sermons delivered by ministers during this period, late 18th, early 19th century, attacking the Constitution because it did not preference or proclaim a Christian republic. In fact, In the latter half of the 19th century, post-Civil War, there were efforts to rewrite the Constitution, the preamble to the United States, to explicitly add references to Christianity and state that we were a Christian nation, to put references to Jesus Christ in the Constitution. Now, we know these efforts didn't pass, but the fact that they were tried is strong evidence that the religious right of that day saw that the Constitution was lacking because it did not establish an officially Christian government. Now, what about this business of the wall of separation between church and state? We hear about that a lot. It's a metaphor that has been invoked by the Supreme Court. It has rung down through the ages from the pen of Thomas Jefferson. It has inspired people. It inspires us at Americans United. What about that? Where did that come from? What did it mean? Why did Jefferson say it? First thing to remember about this, again, another one of the myths of the religious right is that Jefferson's not really important to our story because Madison wrote the First Amendment, and Jefferson was not in the country when that was discussed. But as I've mentioned earlier in this talk, Madison's ideas on religious freedom, the severing of the official state church, the guarantee of religious freedom, that came from the mind of Jefferson and his Virginia statute for religious freedom. So Jefferson actually is very important to the story. Well, what happened is Jefferson was elected president in 1800. There were fears among some of the more conservative clergy in the country, mainly Federalists in New England, that Jefferson was an atheist, that he was trying to destroy religion. Now, Jefferson was not an atheist. Jefferson was what I would call a Christian rationalist. Jefferson admired the moral teachings of Jesus Christ and thought that they were sublime. That was the word he used to describe them. But he rejected the miracle stories of Jesus. He rejected Jesus' divinity. He rejected the Trinity. He rejected the idea that Jesus was some kind of magical being who could create miracles. Jefferson, in fact, is famous for taking the New Testament, cutting out the things he did not believe, which were the miracle stories and the references to divinity, the references to the Trinity, and pasting up what was left to create his own testament, which he called The Life and Morals of Jesus Christ, today known as the Jefferson Bible, and you can still buy copies. It's an amazing document. Take a look at it if you haven't seen it. So Jefferson has this idea of the Enlightenment and religious freedom for everybody. And he would like to let people know that he feels that way, that he's not hostile to religion. Now, back at this time, remember, there's no internet, there's no email, there's no television, no radio, no fax machine, there's nothing like that. If you wanted to get something out, it had to be printed, maybe a broadside, a pamphlet, a newspaper, or a letter. Letters were really good ways to disseminate your ideas if you were a politician, because it was widely understood that what you wrote in a letter was fair game, that could be disseminated or published. So some Baptists in Connecticut wrote to Jefferson. Baptists in Connecticut at the time were living under a quasi-established church, Congregationalism, and they didn't like it. In theory, you could get out of supporting the Congregationalist church if you were not a member, if you appeared before a magistrate and pledged your case. But the Baptists argued, why should we have to do that? Why should we have to beg a government official to give us a right that we believe is inherent? So they wrote to Jefferson, knowing he was a champion of religious freedom, and expressed their support for his views in this area, and discussed their situation in Connecticut, how it wasn't really what to their liking, and they were hoping that Jefferson's view of religious freedom would encompass the entire nation. And this letter was sent to Jefferson, and late 1801 in the fall. On New Year's Day, 1802, Jefferson replied to the Danbury Baptists, and he endorsed that metaphor of the wall of separation between church and state. He used that in the letter. Basically agreed with the Baptists, saying, yes, you're right. Religious freedom should be for everybody. And it was a great thing when we passed our First Amendment, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. So there's the metaphor. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, this was a letter that Jefferson probably knew was going to get out into the hands of the people, because he asked his attorney general to look at it and give some advice, and he also asked the postmaster general to look at it and give some advice. And he even wrote to them in a cover note that this was an opportunity for him to make a statement on religious freedom. His original thought was that he would use the letter to explain why he, as president, did not issue official proclamations calling for prayer and fasting, as the two previous presidents had done. But Jefferson's Attorney General Levi Lincoln thought maybe that wasn't such a good thing to do. That was just going to provoke some of the conservative pastors in New England. Better to leave that out. So Jefferson, with some reluctance, removed that material, but sent the rest of the letter up to Connecticut. So that is strong evidence that Jefferson knew this letter was going to become a public document. And I say that because, again, another myth of the religious right is that Jefferson just, as a courtesy, tossed off this note. It didn't really mean anything. He didn't give it any thought, and the courts have made too much of a deal of it. Well, that's not the case at all. Jefferson knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote that letter. And indeed, within a few days of it being sent to New England and being received in Connecticut, it was appearing in newspapers and being discussed around the country. So, how do we get from that place to an area where we do have religious freedom honored by the states as well? Remember, I talked earlier about how the First Amendment and all the other provisions of the Bill of Rights were only applying to the federal government at that time. Well, what happened is, after the Civil War, a series of amendments were passed to deal with the fallout from that traumatic situation. One of them was the 14th Amendment. Now, I'm not a lawyer. There are lawyers on the AU staff who explain this a lot better than I can. But it is a consensus of many scholars that the clear intent of the 14th Amendment was to bind the Bill of Rights on the states. One of the ways that the rights of all citizens would be protected is if the states had to abide by the provisions of the Bill of Rights. So not only could the federal government not establish an official religion, but the states couldn't do it anymore either. Now that took a while to catch on in the courts. Federal courts sort of resisted that idea for a number of years. But in the early 20th century, they started to embrace it. That's a legal doctrine known as incorporation. And certainly nowadays, it is well established by legal scholars, and I think just about every judge except for Clarence Thomas, that states must follow the Bill of Rights. Well, naturally, this also opened up the door to litigation in the states and challenges to how we would define the separation of church and state. In the federal court system, people who had previously been limited to maybe a state court could now bring their fight into the federal courts. And in fact, we did see that start to happen on a range of church-state issues. Issues like prayer in school, to what extent the government could aid religious institutions. Can the government display religious symbols? What are the limits on religious freedom? All of the things that we're still grappling with today began to filter into the federal courts in the period, say, post-World War II. And indeed, that's also when Americans United was founded in 1947, with all of this activity in the courts making major pronouncements about what separation of church and state meant and handing down important decisions. The decision was made that there needed to be a national organization standing up for the separation of church and state. We were explicitly at that time rooted in faith communities, and we were an organization that brought to bear a lot of religious voices to stand up for the separation of church and state. Now, since then, a lot has changed, and we've come to embrace many different modes of belief and non-belief, but the core idea remains the same. The separation of church and state and secular government are not hostile to religion. The idea is not to tear religion down or to attack it, but in fact, to protect it and the right to non-belief. A theory of religious freedom that did not also encompass the right to reject all religions would be useless. And I think our courts understand that, but there are some people who push back against the idea today. That's another myth of the religious right, the idea that somehow religious freedom only includes your right to choose a faith. It doesn't include your right to reject them all, but that's nonsense. And we can see that even the early founders understood that religious freedom had to include the right to be a non-believer, to have any meaning to it at all. Now, there's some talk there about actual history. I've had some talk there about myth. I want to spend just a little bit of time before I wrap up talking about why these myths hold power. The Christian nation myth is persistent. I've been fighting it in my 33 years here at Americans United, and it's very difficult to kind of finally vanquish it. A lot of people believe it. A lot of people believe that there are explicit protections for Christianity in the Constitution, even though you can plainly read the document and see that there is not. And what's so frustrating about that myth, from my perspective as an advocate of separation of church and state, is that it's like creationism. If you think about the people who have advocated creationism instead of evolution, the story of evolution is an amazing story. It's astounding, worthy of study. The story of creationism is not. I think of the Christian nation myth as a kind of historical creationism. And what offends me about it is that it takes the real story of the development of religious freedom in America, the idea of a country that among its initial settlements was this theocratic state of intolerant people who didn't respect religious freedom, that we got from that to where we are today, a diverse nation of Christians and Jews and Buddhists and Muslims and Hindus and atheists and humanists and every other thing you can think of, with the right to pick your own religion, to change your mind, to deviate, to create your own spiritual brew, to be as Thomas Jefferson once said. Thomas Jefferson was once asked about his own religion, and he said, "I am a sect unto myself as far as I know." And you have that right today. That story is an amazing story. It is a story that deserves to be told. The Christian nation myth cannot hold a candle to that story. So I would just urge all of you, as we end this first session, move into questions, that you embrace that story and that you help us tell it, because it is a good story, it is an important story. And the only plug I'm going to give here is from, I wrote this book some years ago, Why the Religious Right is Wrong About Separation of Church and State, good layperson's history to these issues. So please, if you're interested, I would recommend that to you. And I just want to also conclude by giving all of you my personal thanks. It has been my privilege, and I mean that as a privilege. It is not a burden to defend this cherished principle. It is a privilege and it is an honor. It has been mine to do that for 33 years, and you have made that possible through your financial support of Americans United, through your moral support, through your activism, your speaking out. You have made that possible. You have made my professional life, which has been very fulfilling to me, possible, and I thank you for that. And I thank you for being with us this afternoon, and I look forward to taking any questions or comments you may have.
Thank you so much, Rob. Every time I hear you tell stories from history about religious freedom and separation of religion and government, I learn more. So folks, please do, on the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. If you pop questions into it, we're going to start getting to them. And Rob, I'm going to start with a question from Steve in Ohio. Steve is asking, how would you address someone who says that the Declaration of Independence says, quote, creator, therefore it means the Christian Jesus, when it seems to be actually pretty ambiguous?
Yeah, the history of the Declaration is actually very interesting. I didn't get a chance to get into that, but I recommend you look that up. That was written by Jefferson, of course, and Jefferson included a couple of deistic references. A congressional committee later added a few more, so they weren't even all Jefferson's language, but clearly that's very deistic language. I mean, the deist believes in a God of first cause, but not necessarily a God as defined by Christianity. So that language is in there. But I would also remind people that the Declaration of Independence, as wonderful as it is not a governance document. We don't get rights from that. The Constitution lays out our rights. The Declaration was essentially our announcement to the world. Think of it as an audacious press release telling the world, look, we're done with these people in Britain. We're going our own way. We demand our rights. Here's why.
Rob, on a sort of related note, coming in the chat box from Helen, Helen asks, many progressives seem to think that separation of church and state is not a priority. It's not a issue that is on the top of folks' minds. How might you convince them otherwise?
I would argue, actually, that many of the issues that progressives champion these days rest on the separation of church and state. And imagine in your mind an actual brick wall, a wall of separation between church and state. Resting on that wall are things like reproductive freedom, access to birth control, LGBTQ rights, censorship, the right of your child to attend a public school without being forced to take part in religion, the right to choose your own faith. They rest on that wall. If you blow that wall up, if you undermine it to a point where it's fatally compromised and it collapses, all those rights on top of it, they go down with it. So I see separation of church and state as the linchpin of so many of our freedoms. And I think we just need to be a little more vocal in helping folks understand that.
So I'm going to ask you one more history question and then come once again into some contemporary questions. From a historical question that we received from Dave is can you mention Thomas Paine and how his writings fit into all of this and the story you were telling earlier?
Yeah, Paine is an interesting figure because Paine, of course, wrote Common Sense and some of the documents that really excited people and got them motivated to support the revolution. He's actually an important figure, but he sort of gets pushed out of the picture these days because of something he wrote called The Age of Reason. It's just somebody who's familiar with it, where he outlined his very deistic views and attacked the notion of conventional Christianity. And that caused him to lose some support, and actually he had to leave the country for a while. But essentially, I think Paine's writings were very important to helping people get behind the idea of the revolution. And certainly his deism was shared by a lot of founders, but the way that he presented it offended a lot of people, and that has unfortunately, I think, marred his place in history. And that's a shame because he was an important figure.
Rob, there's some really interesting questions about the interplay between federal standards and states and what state obligations are. Scott asked a question pointing to that moment when Roy Moore suggested that states might establish their own official faith. And then another question from our friends in California asking, how can it be actually a question from Ken, I'm not sure he's from California, asking how is it that some states constitutions still have language about requiring belief in God to be in office? So could you talk a little bit about states versus federal and some of the issues that come up there?
Sure, yeah. First thing, though, you have to understand about a guy like Roy Moore is that he doesn't actually believe in the 14th Amendment, sort of tends to think that either it doesn't say what it plainly says or that it should be ignored. And he does argue that states should have the power to, even in the modern era, proclaim a certain religion as their favorite, which is just completely ridiculous. But pretty much a lot of what Roy Moore believes is pretty ridiculous. This question about states and constitutions and what they say, very interesting, because you're right. A number of states do have provisions in them that still restrict public office, limit it to Christians or certain types of Christians. Now, those provisions were all invalidated by a Supreme Court ruling from a 1961 case called Torcaso v. Watkins. So they can't be enforced, but they're still in some of those constitutions, and certainly I can understand why non-believers find those offensive. The interplay of federalism and what states can do and what the federal government can do, that's an ongoing discussion in our culture and in our history. But I do think that it should be pretty clear that because of the 14th Amendment and the protections found therein, states can't restrict your core freedoms any more than the federal government can.
Thank you, Rob. And then we have a few questions. Cheryl has asked a great question and a few others saying, how do we, those who have a very different view of religious freedom, Christian nationalists or religious nationalists or the religious right, those are all different ways to describe some folks who hold that view, often complain that their religious freedom is being abused when they can't bring their religion into the public sphere or into government, such as posting 10 commandments in courthouses or mandating prayer in public schools. How do we address that? How do we talk to those folks?
Right. I think the first place to start is to remind those folks about the incredible privileged position that religion enjoys in American culture and government. Think about it for a minute. Complete tax exemption, which they get by mere dint of their existence. They don't even have to apply for it. They're usually exempt from any number of laws that apply to similarly situated secular entities. There's often a carve out for houses of worship. Participation in faith-based initiatives, which they take part in, the right to hire and fire their employees. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have these rights, but I'm just making the point that there is a long list of rights that religious organizations have that show that their position, far from being one of persecution, is actually one of great privilege. So I think that's the first place to begin, is to remind folks about things like that. And the second sort of thing to keep in mind is that it can be very seductive sometimes for folks to think, well, my view is the majority view, and therefore it should dominate. Most people in the country are Christian, therefore we should have a Christian cross outside City Hall. Uh, the danger in that thinking is that what kind of a situation we have today may not always be the situation we have in the years to come. Think about the demographic changes that have occurred in this country just within the past 20 years or so, with the rise of people who say they are nuns, Nones. Would you really want to live in a culture where it just happened to be whoever had numerical superiority got to dominate? And I think even thoughtful Christians will stop for a minute and think about that it's better to have a system where everybody makes these decisions for themselves than live under, a de facto theocratic state.
Yeah, Rob, that leads into a great series of questions, this idea of the majority. Some questions that we've had around how religious freedom has been used or misused over the course of history as a tool of enforcing white hegemony or white supremacy or racism. Some specific questions about how religious freedom was used in the context of Native American or American Indian removal programs or in the creation and maintenance of the enslavement of Black Africans in the United States. So can you speak a little bit about some of the historical context related to religious freedom and race?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things we need to understand is that our record in this area is absolutely not unblemished. That even though the founders embraced a broad vision of religious freedom, that it has not always been executed or played out that way. There have been plenty of bumps along the road. Think about the laws that existed in many southern states that either curbed the rights of enslaved people to worship or controlled the material they could be exposed to. Think about the laws that were passed that actually banned certain Native American religious expressions because somebody decided they were dangerous. There have been instances like that. Now, it is true, religious freedom is not an absolute right. There are always going to be curbs and conditions and controls on what you could do. And we're seeing that play out right now in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. But at the same time, we have sought to maximize that freedom to the extent that it is possible. And when you have these instances in history where we haven't even pretended to respect that principle, where we have taken away the religious freedom of entire classes of people, and used that type of oppression as a tool of subjugation. We have to look at that history squarely in the face. One of the things I didn't really get a chance to get into during my remarks, but one of the myths that's very much championed by Christian nationalists is this idea of what I call the myth of national goodness, that the United States has always been God's favorite nation. We've always done things right, and it's just been great. And there are people that get really offended when you point out the huge track record of injustice which stares you in the face. And normally the people who make these types of arguments are folks who are operating from a system of privilege. They're not members of the communities that have been oppressed. They're not members of the communities that have had their rights taken away. And it can be very difficult for them to grasp that. The historian's first task, and I speak as an amateur, is to face history squarely on, and that includes all the ugliness. And believe me, there's plenty of it.
Rob, on that note of facing history head on and ugliness, we have some questions about what happened yesterday in this country and what happened earlier today, particularly related to President Trump forcibly removing protesters on his way to a church to hold up a Bible for a photo opportunity. Reports now coming out that, in fact, the military police or the Secret Service or the Capitol Police actually removed members of the clergy from the steps or from inside the building. It's unclear as reporters dig into that story. So just some looking for some reflections or perhaps thoughts informed by history of what we've seen in this country in just the last 24 hours.
Yes, it's very discouraging. If any of you read Americans United's blog, The Wall of Separation, I have some thoughts about what happened yesterday with Trump's use of the Bible and literally waving that in front of a church that he had not been invited to, and the way that protesters were tear gassed and shot out with rubber bullets. Again, this is an old story. Many instances in our history of people of ill intent cloaking that intent in religion. In a society where the majority of people think well of faith and are religious themselves, the temptation to by some state officials to usurp religion's goodwill and use it as a cloak to cover up their misdeeds is simply too strong and powerful. So there are always going to be individuals that seek to do that. One of the things that I have been very heartened by is that religious leaders all over this country are today speaking out so forcefully about what's been happening in this country and lifting up their voices in protest and letting it be known that in the case of Christian clergy, that this is not their definition of Christianity. This is not their understanding of Christianity. Remember that the type of oppressive, extremely conservative Christian nationalism embraced by some Christians in this country is not the majority view of that faith. And a lot of people are speaking out, and I'm happy to hear it.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you all of our participants, well over 100 folks joining us today. And I want to take note of where we closed, of acknowledging this moment in our country and what we are living through as we confront the history of racism in this country and the way forward together. So I want to thank you for joining us today. I could sit all day on a Zoom call with Rob or in his office, and the opportunity to learn so much more and the richness of this conversation. Please join us next week. This same time, same place, 1 week from today, we'll be visiting with American United attorneys who will be talking about the Supreme Court. We actually have at least 4 Supreme Court decisions that we are waiting on literally any moment. Some of them may come down before next Tuesday or even on next Tuesday. So it will be truly timely breaking news for all of you next week. So we look forward to seeing you. We welcome your comments or questions by email. Feel free to get on au.org/summer series or go to au.org to find Rob and I's email address and reach out to us. Until then, we hope that you are well and that your family is staying safe and healthy, and we'll look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.